Sicha, about unity and separation. Learning about kilayim, which are the things that are individually are permitted, but when you mix them together, they become forbidden. So it's basically the forbidden mixtures. And we're not talking about alchemy here. We learn it from the verses of the Torah that say, don't sow different seeds in your vineyard. We see a different verse that tells us not to graft. We have, don't plow with an ox and a donkey together. And then that other same verse says, don't crossbreed. Don't wear a mixture of wool and linen together. The other one says, a garment of wool and linen should not come upon you. I'm specifying that because last time the commentary they will show that there's a difference in the wording when it talks about shatnez. In this particular case, where we have the three separate verses, the first mitzvah that's spoken about afterwards is tzitzis, to tell us that there's an exemption / command when it comes to tzitzis. They could wear shatnez, and also we know the clothing of the priests of the Kohanim and the Beis HaMikdash, they could also wear shatnez. The underlying question of the whole Sicha is why is shatnez different, that there could be an exception for it. And all that we are learning in the commentary that explains like this, not like this, etc., etc., it's actually laying the groundwork for the information that we're going to get to eventually. And it is based upon the fact that shatnez is the only kind of kilayim that can actually separate it afterwards. Which leads us into another category of kilayim, which is not part of what we see here, the verse is the main category. Commentaries tell us actually this is also kilayim, which is mixing meat and milk. Part of that, the way that the Torah tells us is don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, because only when you cook it does it become a new unit. Until then, in theory, if you're marinating meat in milk, I could wash the milk off. Not just that, why can't I have cold meat with cold cheese? They haven't combined into a single unit. Still prohibited, but in theory, according to the Torah, that is actually allowed because we're just putting one against the other. It's the rabbis who say, no, don't do that. Putting them next to each other is not a new unit. Okay, obviously you haven't mixed it together, but if I make a salad, let's say I chop it up together, I haven't created a new unit out of it. It's only cooking that creates the new unit. And that's from the Torah is forbidden. We learned a lot of commentary about what is kilayim. So that's Ramban or Bein Bachya. When you're mixing stuff up, you're crossing wires up above. So Hashem created a set order for everything in creation. Everything Hashem said you will perpetuate as a species as long as you reproduce after your kind. Ramban tells us it's actually telling us what the wiring of creation is, that things can only reproduce after their kind. So if you try to mix things that are not the same kind, they either will not reproduce, or if something does come of it, like a horse and a donkey, which are kind of related, but they're still not the same kind, you get a mule, but the mule reproduction is cut off because God said, no, don't do this. There's a mass variety within creation. We don't need to be creating new stuff. It's not your job to be Frankensteining stuff. It's your job to take what's already there and finish it. As in, use it for what it's supposed to be used for. That's how you complete creation. And then we saw also the idea of mixing up the different species. We see how it could have such negative consequences, such fatal consequences even. When we see the story of Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel, one brought flax, that's linen, one brought the sheep, one brought wool, and we see how they couldn't get along with each other. The only exception that we have when wool and linen can get along with each other, and there's not this kind of fallout from it, is only when it's wholly submitted to divinity. It's wholly submitted to godliness, which we see in the Beis HaMikdash. So the avnet, the belt that the priests wore, because in Beis HaMikdash is all about mitigating the powers of impurities. So there's not going to be conflict between a spirit of evil and a spirit of good. That's not going to exist there, because the Beis HaMikdash is all about conquering that. So that can work there. We see in the Eshet Chayil of King Solomon, of Shlomo Melech, the Eshet Chayil, she works with both together because she is the epitome of a God-fearing woman. There's no susceptibility to mixing up the wrong things there. Then we see it with tzitzis, because tzitzis is the reminder of what we're here about, which is conquering, submitting, making submissive impurities to the powers of holiness. Aside from that, we don't mix it. We saw more commentary about is the mitzvah of kilayim, which of them apply in the land of Israel, outside the land of Israel, because most of the laws that we have that are agriculture pertaining to the land, that's for the land of Israel, like Shemitah, for example, the sabbatical year. So does kilayim apply also? Grafting and cross species and all that kind of stuff, does that also apply outside the land of Israel? So there's debate about is it a Torah law, is it a rabbinic law, etc. Either way, we're not allowed to graft, because grafting is basically like crossbreeding just for plants, and crossbreeding is not allowed either way. We went through the whole thing about if it combines at the thread level, if it combines at the garment level, so either way it's not allowed. It depends if that's Torah or for the rabbis, but either way it's just none of this is allowed. Rambam brings it in, says just wool and linen just never together ever. Essentially, we still haven't answered the question of why Shan is different, but we keep adding to see how it expands so much, because we're still on the discovery to figure out what is it about Shan is, aside from the fact that it's the only kind of climate you could actually separate afterwards. As we keep saying, there's no word for wool and linen together. It's not a new kind of material that we've created, because at essential level you could take them apart. Versus you can't do that with something that's been grafted or crossbred. Very brief recap, and that brings us to the text of section number 4. So we've completed 3 sections of the Sicha so far, and now we're at text of section 4. Apiza Muvan, Shagader Saruvas Bebasa Bachalav, Hu Kain, Eifin Mamuta Ben Bez Afane, Taruvas Anal, and Eskilel. According to this, we could understand that the gedder, the boundary, the category of mixing basar b'chalav, meat and milk, is not like the way that we find it with the other kind of mixtures, as in with crossbreeding and grafting. We already knew when we introduced mixing meat and milk that there's something different about it, which is part of why it's not part of that main introduction of kilayim. It's actually brought in by commentators to say actually there's a crossover there, that it's not just the laws of kosher, it's actually a kilayim. So this we sort of explained, but here the Rebbe is delineating it in this section of the Sicha. As the sections of the Sicha go on, there's a very clear structure to how the Rebbe is going to get to the lesson that we're going to learn from all of this. So now we're learning it piece by piece. We're putting in one brick at a time. Then eventually we'll see how it all comes together. The mixing of meat and milk is not like the category, the other kind of kilayim, as we've said, because it doesn't affect the power of reproduction, but it has to do with the growth for the generations, etc. Because it doesn't affect the actual essence, the physical essence itself. Part of the thing that we said about kilayim, remember we're saying that we're crossing wires? So we're talking about how crossbreeding and grafting, it affects the reproduction, which you will be in existence as long as you reproduce after your kind. Because of that, the crossbreeding / the grafting affects something inherent to the creatures or what the plants are. So there's something very fundamental that's getting changed when kilayim happens with them. Meat and milk is not like that. Meat and milk is already a removed entity from the original entity. It's not the cow itself, it's a piece of meat, and the milk is derivative from the cow. You're not affecting something essential about the origin point when you put meat and milk together. It's also not the same as shatnez, which we've kind of touched upon. Because as we've already said, that when you're mixing shatnez, that when you're mixing wool and linen together, remember, it also doesn't affect at the essential level because we can remove it afterwards. We can take them apart afterward. Versus crossbreeding and grafting. You can't take it apart afterward. They're all kind of kilayim, but it's different kinds of kilayim. One affects at the essential level, which we see that reproduction gets cut off or doesn't happen. One we see that you can mix it together and it kind of is a new entity, but not really. We don't even have like a new word for it when you put wool and linen together. We're just told it's two different forces that you're mixing. Don't do that. And then meat and milk also, there's something different about the mixture of it. It happens at a different level and the effect is different. So you can't separate it like shatnez, but there's a new entity that gets created when you cook it, which is what we're going to be saying now. So specifically when it comes to, remember, the prohibition of the Torah, not of the sages, not the overall prohibition. When it comes to meat and milk, specifically the prohibition comes from cooking them because one gives flavor to the other. Now we're creating the new entity. And even more than this, so even if you would soak one in the other, if you would leave one in the other for the whole day, yes, some sort of flavor would still go. So if you soaked meat in milk the whole day, you didn't necessarily make a new entity. You could say, oh, you could wash it off, but come on, the milk kind of flavored the meat at a certain point. But even that, theoretically, according to Torah, would be permitted. It's forbidden, but according to Torah, would be permitted. Still, the Isser of the Torah, what's forbidden for the Torah, is specifically according to cooking. So no other combination is forbidden but cooking. The prohibition of meat and milk is specifically coming from the Torah when you're taking two things and you're making something new out of it. So only when you cook meat and milk together do you actually create something new. Otherwise, they're two separate entities. So yes, one might touch the other, flavor the other, but it's not in an essential manner. Again, that's how we're seeing that there's something different about meat and milk. Brackets here in the Sicha that you could say that this is the reason for Rabbi Levi. So we're going to see Rabbi Levi in the Gemara that he says that the amount of a kazayis is an olive bulk. They call it the size of an olive, which is considered like an item of substance. So that's applicable when it comes to saying brachos and mentioning and things like that. So there's something that the olive size is used as a measurement in various kinds of ways. When you say that basar b'chalav, meat and milk, when you have a kazayis, you've reached the meat and milk thing. Rabbi Levi says that this applies not when each are an olive size, but together they create an olive size. So even if the olive size is half and half, that together this cooked item is an olive size, that is where the prohibition begins. That is where the prohibition begins. That when it's each of them together creating an olive size, not one and one creating an olive size, that is where the prohibition begins. Which is, side note, kind of separate than there's an idea in kashrus about batal b'shishim, which is a 1:60 ratio. For example, you have a big pot of chicken soup, but a little bit of milk falls in. So if the 1:60 ratio applies, then you don't necessarily have to dump the whole pot of chicken soup. So that's different than what we're saying here. Here we're talking about the olive size of something, but that is now an entity. It's an item of substance. So Rabbi Levi says that when together they create it, that's where the prohibition begins. Because the prohibition from the Torah is not necessarily don't create a new entity of meat and milk, which occurs when you cook them together. So the prohibition, where does that begin with? It begins when they're both together in olive size. So it's a little bit of a short section here, but that's what this section here is covering. Delineation of what makes meat and milk different than the other kinds of kilayim.